Hello, and it's great to have you with me this evening. So it's Bank Holiday Monday. Hope you all had a great Easter and that you've eaten as much chocolate as I have, which is way too much, but I guess that's what Easter is all about. So I'm going to do a bit of reading this evening, and I'm going to go back to my Usborne books, which cover the history of Britain. And this book is Britain since the war. So I'm assuming that's World War II. Okay. So, quite an interesting set of events. There's been some massive changes since the war, something that I often focus on with my job, because I do, as I've said before, I do therapy with dementia patients, and reminiscence is such a big part of that. And they obviously, some of them were born during the war or remember parts of the Second World War, and they certainly remember how life has changed since the war. So I'm going to find this quite interesting, and I hope you will too. So on the back I'm going to read the blurb, which says, "From street parties at the end of the war to celebrations on the eve of the new millennium," which obviously I remember. This book tells the story of Britain after the Second World War. Find out how life in Britain changed through the post-war austerity years, the swinging 60s, the decline of industries, and the rise of new technologies. Okay, before I get started, I'm just going to pour myself a cup of peppermint tea, because I get quite parched when I'm reading, so it's nice to have something to drink. So just bear with me a minute. Thank you. Okay, so I've got my peppermint tea now. So I'm just going to have a little taste and see if it's too hot. Yeah, a little bit too hot. So I'll have some more of that in a bit. I've also switched on my lava lamp, but it's taking forever to warm up. Okay, I'm just going to move it slightly out the way. So there's a wonderful picture here about the end of the Second World War, and obviously there's a soldier there returning home to his wife and child, which is lovely. So there's a little introduction here that says post-war Britain. The British people had endured years of sacrifice during the Second World War. So when peace came, they wanted comfortable homes, well-paid jobs, and a better way of life. While politicians worked to rebuild the country, old industries fell into decline, and the colonial empire that had provided wealth and global status for centuries broke apart. The nation struggled to find its place in a changing world, as immigration from former colonies and new rights for women and minority groups made life in Britain fairer, richer, and more diverse than ever before. first chapter's called Advance Britannia, and there's a picture there of Churchill. After 5 agonising years of war, the people of Britain spilled onto the streets on May the 8th, 1945, to celebrate one of the greatest triumphs in their nation's history, VE Day, Victory in Europe. The German army, which had come so close to destroying their homes and their way of life, had at last been crushed. Men and women from all backgrounds had fought shoulder to shoulder to defend their country, and they looked forward to a brighter future. There's a picture of the crowds on the streets, and there's a quote from Churchill saying, "We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget for a moment the toil and efforts that lie ahead. Advance Britannia." He was already 70 years old at the end of the Second World War, which is incredible really, because he became Prime Minister again for a second time a few years later. The people decide. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had done more than anyone to steer the country through the dangerous war years. So when he had called an election only weeks after VE Day, he was confident that voters would choose his Conservative Party. He was stunned by the result, a landslide win for the Labour Party. Heaven on earth. Labour pledged to end the miseries that had plagued the country for centuries. Poverty, bad housing, and a lack of proper medical care. The party leader, Clement Attlee, talked of building a new Jerusalem, a paradise for British people, in reference to a patriotic song. Attlee had embraced the ideas of William Beveridge, an economist who proposed a social care system, or the welfare state, that would offer government support to individuals at every stage of their lives, from cradle to grave. Labour went further than Beveridge, promising a free national health service, jobs for all, millions of new houses, and nationalisation of struggling industries, bringing them under state control. It was an ambitious plan for a better Britain, and the public backed it. Global Guardian. Attlee, that's a picture of Attlee, had the hopes of the nation on his shoulders, but Britain had huge international responsibilities too. Around the world, many people in Britain's vast empire were calling for change and relying on the new government to grant them greater independence. In the Far East, the war was still raging against Germany's last remaining ally, Japan. It would be months before some British servicemen came home. And this is a poster that helped Labour win the election. If Winston Churchill was a political lion, then Clement Attlee was quiet as a mouse, supposedly described by Churchill as a modest little man with a lot to be modest about. One story goes that Clement Attlee was so nervous when he met King George VI to be appointed Prime Minister that he was silent for several minutes. "I've won the election," he finally announced. "I know," replied the king. "I heard it on the news." Bitter recovery. The first job for Attlee's government was to rebuild and revive a war-ravaged country. Britain's cities, factories, merchant fleet and railway network were bomb-blasted and crumbling, and most of the nation's wealth had been spent on the war. People of all ages and occupations looked tired and haggard after the years of turmoil and hard work. All around them were stark reminders of the high price they had paid for victory. A costly peace. 3 months after VE Day, an American plane dropped an atomic bomb on Japan. Japan's leaders surrendered on August the 15th, 1945. This date, known as VJ Day, marked the end of the Second World War. Church bells and ship sirens rang out across Britain as communities lit bonfires and held street parties. But the mood of celebration was more subdued than VE Day. People had hoped life would get easier when peace came, but instead things seemed tougher than ever. Going hungry. In 1940, the government had introduced rationing to preserve stocks of food, textiles and fuel. Shoppers exchanged coupons for a weekly basket of goods. People had tolerated these strict controls during wartime, but when the war ended, the country was still starved of supplies. Bread was added to the ration list in 1946, and luxuries such as new clothes, magazines, sweets, and perfume were difficult to find. The British public were dismayed by these lingering hardships, but rationing continued until 1954. Just gonna have a quick drink. So there's a quote here from Clement Attlee. "I have no easy words for the nation. I cannot say when we shall emerge into easier times." Something fishy. It's a picture of a boy there with a fish on his plate. Fresh meat was always in short supply at this time, so government officials encouraged the public to eat horse flesh and whale steak, which was rubbery and tasted like cod liver oil. The government also imported millions of cans of snook, a pungent, oily fish from South Africa. People turned their noses up at snook, and most of it was mashed into pet food. Cap in hand. Shop shelves were empty, and so were the government's bank vaults. It had been an expensive war, and the nation had only survived thanks to the donations of vital materials from America. These stopped abruptly after VJ Day, so Attlee sent his top financial expert, John Maynard Keynes to Washington to ask the Americans for a cash gift. Keynes returned with a huge loan that saved the economy in the short term, but wasn't paid off until 2006. That's incredible, isn't it? The Big Freeze. In February 1947, Britain was hit by the coldest weather in living memory. Deep snowdrifts cut off villages and trapped trains between stations. Farm animals left out in fields froze to death, and factories and power stations ran short of coal. Struggling with rationing, debt, snow and ice, people could only grit their teeth and look forward to better times. This is a picture of a family wheeling coal home. It says, "No wonder they're smiling. Coal was hard to come by, and domestic electricity supplies were regularly cut off for several hours." And there's a picture there of the thaw. During the Big Freeze of 1947, Britain was subjected to heavy snow and temperatures as low as -21. Temperatures rose in mid-March, bringing even more misery. Ice and snow melted rapidly, causing terrible flooding, which was made even worse by severe gales and torrential rains. As water levels rose, police and the armed forces had to rescue many people from their water-logged homes. Really tough time. Homes for Heroes. British soldiers were praised as heroes, but most of them came home to join their families, living in run-down and crowded rooms, with few of the comforts we enjoy today, like electricity, hot water, and private bathrooms. Even before the war, there hadn't been enough houses to go round. Building projects had stopped during the fighting, and millions of homes had been damaged or destroyed by German bombs. Now the government ordered a frenzy of construction that dramatically changed the look of Britain's towns and cities. Prefabulous. Brick houses would be slow to build, but the government quickly provided thousands of homes in the form of prefabs. These boxy bungalows, pictures of them there, were assembled using light panels that were made in advance or prefabricated in former aircraft factories. They could be slotted together in a day or two, and they're still going strong today. Flat pack palaces. This photograph shows prefabs being unloaded from trucks. Some people dismissed prefabs as ugly rabbit hutches or sardine tins, but they were snug, clean, and came equipped with fridges, full-size baths, and kitchen cupboards. Many families became very attached to these new homes. The politician Neil Kinnock said that spending his childhood in a prefab was like living in a spaceship. Boom times. Although some prefabs are still standing today, they were only designed to last for around 10 years. Permanent homes were needed urgently, and the demand was growing. After the trauma and upheaval of the war, people were anxious to get on with family life. More than 400,000 couples got married in 1947. What followed became known as the baby boom. 1 million more babies were born in the 5 years after the war than had been born in the 5 years before the war. Families on low incomes were the worst affected by the housing shortage. They couldn't afford to buy their own homes, so the government asked local councils to build houses for families to rent. A typical council house had 3 bedrooms, an indoor bathroom, and lots of storage space. Council houses offered many families a big improvement in living standards, but they were often built in large estates, packed closely together. This alarmed some politicians who claimed they split communities into rich and poor. Architects and planners didn't have enough land to build houses for everyone, so they also built tower blocks of flats up to 30 floors high in order to squeeze as many homes as possible into Britain's crowded cities. By the end of the 1960s, the housing crisis was over, but at a price. Many tower blocks had been cheaply built and poorly planned. They earned a reputation for being deprived and crime-infested places to live. All mod cons. Immediately after the war, many people were trapped living in dirty city slums. Lots of children had to share beds with their siblings, and most people had to bathe in tin tubs and use outside toilets. Only wealthy families could afford to have central heating or refrigerators and washing machines in their homes. By the mid-50s, these modern conveniences, or mod cons, were much more widely available. Even so, by 1960, only around 1 in 5 households had a fridge. This illustration comes from a 1951 advert for fridges. Just going to have a quick drink again. Unity and division. In July 1948, the eyes of the world turned to London for the first Olympic Games in 12 years. After years of war, British organisers were determined that the London Olympics would be a beacon of international peace and teamwork. King George VI welcomed the world's athletes to a war-bruised and rather shabby London for an Olympic Games that was put together on a shoestring budget. Competitors brought their own food, trained in overcrowded public swimming pools, and rode on packed underground trains to Wembley Stadium. But the event was a dazzling success. Everyone involved had pitched in to help, and the sporting spirit of the Olympics shone through. There's a picture of the Olympic Games there. It's called the Austerity Games. The 1948 Olympics is often referred to as the Austerity Games because it was staged on a very tight budget. Competitors were asked to bring their own towels, and many wore homemade kits. The London athletes were given packed lunches to get them through the day's training. A cheese sandwich, an apple and a boiled egg. Olympians earned nothing from the sport in the 1940s, and many British contestants had jobs in offices and factories. They had to ask for time off work, and some even had their wages stopped. Incredible. The Iron Curtain. However, while almost 60 countries entered the Olympics, the Soviet Union was not among them. Britain, America, and the Soviets had fought together during the war, but tensions were growing between the former allies in a clash of politics and beliefs that became known as the Cold War. Soviet troops had swept across Eastern Europe in the course of the war. When the fighting ended, they took control of the countries they occupied and fortified the borders. In 1946, Churchill described this new frontier as an iron curtain across Central Europe. He and other Western politicians were alarmed by the Soviet Union's growing military strength and worried that trouble brewing in Berlin might spark another war. Berlin under siege. At the end of the war, Germany had been carved into 4 zones, each governed by one of the 4 main allies: America, France, and Britain in the west, and the Soviet Union in the east. The German capital, Berlin, was also shared between them, but it was located deep within Soviet-run East Germany. In June 1948, the Soviets tried to dislodge the Western Allies by setting up a blockade. They closed all the roads, railways and waterways, planning to starve the 2 million people living in West Berlin into accepting Soviet rule. Sky cargo. Britain and America refused to abandon the city. In June 1948, they launched the Berlin Airlift, flying coal, medicines and food to West Berlin in a vast fleet of cargo planes. In a joint operation lasting more than a few years, the British RAF and the US Air Force flew more than 1,000 flights a day, until the Soviets grudgingly reopened the city's supply routes. But Berlin would remain a dangerous and divided city for another 40 years. You can see a picture of some German children cheering as a US cargo plane flies over. And here we can see a map of Europe, so there's NATO countries, that's where it's under Soviet control, and these were neutral countries in the yellow. Fearing a military strike by the Soviets, Britain and America and 10 other nations set up the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. NATO members agreed to fight together if any member country was attacked. This military alliance acted as a wall across Europe to stop any Soviet advance. Sunset over the empire. At its peak, British Empire covered 1/4 of the world's land, and for centuries it was a reminder of Britain's superpower status. But after the turmoil of 2 world wars, it had become a costly burden for people at home and abroad wanted independence for the colonies. The government started to untangle Britain's overseas ties and responsibilities, and before long the empire vanished from the maps. With its cotton, tea and precious gemstones, India had been a prized and closely guarded colony throughout Victorian times. But by the brink of the 1940s, the country was in chaos and on the brink of civil war. Although the Indian people had been calling for independence for decades, rival religious groups among them had very different visions for the future. British officials struggled to arrange a peaceful transfer of power, but in 1947 they were forced to split the land in 2. The southern part kept the name of India and became a new independent state. The northern part became a separate Muslim country called Pakistan. Millions of people had to leave their homes to join their religious communities, and many thousands died in violence along the border. So, there's a picture here of some NATO soldiers, I think. It says in 1919 a panel of countries had established the League of Nations to promote international peace and justice. After its failure to prevent the Second World War, the League reformed as the United Nations in 1945. UN troops act as peacekeepers in war zones worldwide. They wear baby blue berets and helmets. And there's a poster here from 1947 which promotes the UN with its Tree of Peace, with the flags of the member nations as its leaves. No peace for Palestine. After the First World War, the League of Nations had appointed Britain to govern several territories in the Middle East. These included Palestine, where the British government had promised land to Jews from around the world to build a new nation. As tens of thousands of Jews arrived in Palestine, the local Arab population feared they would be forced out of their homeland, and riots broke out between the Jews and the Arabs. After the Second World War, Jewish immigration increased and the situation worsened. British troops had to patrol the streets while diplomats tried to satisfy the demands of both groups. It was an impossible challenge. British forces pulled out of Palestine in 1948, leaving behind them a conflict that still rages today. Mother Country. Meanwhile, an old troopship called Empire Windrush was steaming across the Atlantic, carrying passengers from Jamaica to Britain. As colonial subjects, many of them had fought for Britain in the war, alongside millions of men from the rest of the empire. Now they were taking up the British government's invitation for people from the colonies to move to Britain and fill the jobs of workers who had died in the war. Immigrants later flowed in from the rest of the Caribbean, Africa and Asia too. On the whole, the new arrivals were given a warm greeting, but immigrants still faced racial prejudice at work, in their choice of housing and in their everyday life. Things don't change, do they? Despite these torments, many of these post-war immigrants decided to stay. They and their families are now an integral part of British culture and society. And there's a picture there of the Empire Windrush. The wind of change is blowing through this continent. This is a line from a speech made by British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan during a visit to Africa in 1960. 3 years earlier, the Gold Coast, now Ghana, had become the first British colony in Africa to gain independence. By 1963, Nigeria, the Southern Cameroons, British Somaliland, Sierra Leone, Uganda, Kenya and Tanzania had all followed. So I'm going to leave it there for now, and I will do another video where I carry on with this book. Okay, and I hope you enjoyed listening to some of that, and I think it's a fascinating time in British history, and it's really important that we don't forget these important events, as they have shaped the way we all live now. So I will leave it there for tonight and say thank you again for joining me, and I really hope to see you soon. So take care everybody, see you soon.